Cannot find tanks for your group? No problem, watch this video. Tanks have been nerfed and they suck now? No problem, watch this video. You want a tank but dying tactics routes and not getting people mad is a problem? I said no problem, watch this video. There's no surprise that you are getting ready for the first season of The War Within and there are no tanks in sight. Neither are there healers, but one issue at a time. Maybe you wanted to give tanking a try, or maybe you are just fed up with the lack of tanks and thought you can give it a go. Or maybe you are annoyed that you feel you have to tank or you will never get into groups in time. You shouldn't have to, but here we are. It's not that bad, let me tell you, and even if you are scared or simply refuse to take up the mantle, tanking might actually be way cooler than you think. So what do you stand to gain from tanking? Let me start by prefacing that I know it sucks to not be able to play the spec you wanted to play and feel you need to swap roles. But I will also tell you why swapping roles will end up with you playing the spec you want on top of a lot of benefits you did not expect. Like dope-ass wallpapers with your character transmogs if you become a Patreon. You'll also be supporting videos like these among the entire Marcelian Online team. This content would be a lot less frequent and lower quality if it wouldn't be for the support of our patrons. Link is down below. Off the bat, tanking will push you into a different mindset, especially if you are coming from a DPS role. Let's go through these one at a time from most important to least. When you get into combat, the most important thing you need to accomplish is maintaining aggro. You might think it's surviving and you are not far off, but what's the point of surviving if you drop aggro and get your group killed one at a time? Aggro is important and it can be achieved in two main ways: deliberately and passively. Passively is when you are just doing your proper rotation and the sheer amount of DPS you have is enough to keep mobs and bosses glued to you. This is a privilege if it happens to be the case, and you will cherish it. It's also a somewhat bad thing because it teaches a lot of tanks bad habits. It's like relying on external power in the form of trinkets and legendaries as a DPS player, and it turns out that the game just plays itself for you instead you gaming the plays. You need to be aware and in control of your aggro, or when a nerf hits your tank or get an overgeared red paladin in your group, they will die every pull and you won't know why. The deliberate way of building aggro is the legit way. This means always pulling the boss with a taunt and whatever your pull ability is as a tank. The only time a DPS player dies at the start of the pull is if they didn't wait for the timer. Of course, taunt doesn't build aggro by itself. You still have to cast stuff during the time for it to be efficient, but of course you knew that. In AoE scenarios, once you already have the mobs on you, you want to always rotate through your targets as you do damage. Bears want to spread their moonfires on everything. As a warrior, you will want to shield slam as many targets as possible to make sure there isn't one lonely mob in the pack you only hit with a few small cleave hits while your fire mage is mongoing on it like it just stole its car keys and his dog is trapped in the locked car during August. If you don't do this, you will turn into one of those tanks that just randomly loses aggro mid-combat for some reason. It happens to everyone, don't worry. Tanks naturally do less damage than DPS, but their threat generation is higher. What does that mean? Well, as a very crude example, let's say that a DPS player generates 1 point of threat per point of damage. Tanks usually, depending on the tuning of the game, do several times that, which right now should be about 6.5 times higher. That means that for every point of damage, tanks do 6.5 points of threat. That means that as long as the DPS players don't outdamage you by 6.5 times, you'll never lose aggro, which conversely means that if there's a machine in your group that does 7 times your DPS, you will have to rotate taunts or something to keep mobs on you, since that DPS will generate more threat than you. The 6.5 times multiplier is just an example. It usually changes as tuning happens. What you need to remember is that damage is still important and it naturally translates into aggro. The second most important thing is survivability. Now that you are successfully keeping aggro, meaning you are doing relatively good damage, you have to make sure you won't die. This is where the spec knowledge comes in, and since this is not a guide, I will just give examples instead of talking about all specs one at a time. As a paladin, for instance, this means you have to always be in your consecration for that damage reduction buff, but also keep up your shield of the righteous. Past this, which is the generic active mitigation, you have cooldowns and words of glory. If your healer struggles to keep your HP bar up or a big mechanic is about to happen, pop a defensive cooldown appropriate to what's happening. For instance, all of Paladin's defensives give damage reduction across the board. Warrior, however, has stuff like Spell Reflect, which can reflect spells but also give magic damage reduction. Death Knight has Anti-Magic Shell for obvious purposes. This aspect of the game goes deeper, of course, and has a lot of factors into it which you will learn as you play. But for now, understanding the concept comes first. The third most important thing to do is what I like to call enabling your DPS. This means playing in a way where it's easy for your DPS players to destroy the encounter. This can range from positioning the boss and pack facing away from your group to not force them to dodge unnecessary frontals. Crowd controlling as much as possible to not force your DPS to break their rotation to CC, and so on. Yes, I understand that a lot of mules just charge in, eyes closed and fingers crossed, and eat all the tank frontals, or will never use CC or interrupt casts at all. It sucks, but you, together with your healer, are actual babysitters for your DPS players. They don't know that, or will ever admit it, since it's already so hard to combust in the pack that they forgot they even have bloodlust. It's okay. You won't forget, because you are clearly the better person. Jokes aside, good tanks do indeed do this. Not all tanks, of course, but a good tank that keeps the pack in the rain of fire is hard to come by, and trust me, if you do that, your warlocks will 100% notice, even if they won't say it. You will make friends. Next in line is the fourth best thing, and that is considering your healer. This is a bit abstract because it relies on each spec individually that you play and the spec that your healer plays. Generally, this means to use defensives a bit more, even if normally you should be healed through the damage that you take. This means definitely using a strong defensive or heal if you notice someone in your party not dodging a mechanic and almost dying, immediately forcing the healer to respond. This means helping with affixes, dispels, and other responsibilities that will 100% make the job harder for your healer if left unchecked when everyone else is already taking so much damage. Don't get it twisted. If by the time the season starts, dungeons and maybe raids as well don't get massive tuning passes for the damage people take, the content will be likely very punishing. Last but not least, as with everything in life, really, be open to criticism if you want to improve and make your runs easier, of course. It would be ideal if the criticism is constructive, but it won't always be. And it sucks when it isn't. But people are people and you can't change them. You can, however, change how you process the criticism. And if a DPS is saying that you suck for losing aggro, maybe you didn't actually suck. Maybe you pulled the Grim Batol pack with the Overseer, targeted the Overseer Lieutenant as you should since you are not a Muppet, while the DPS went zug-zug on a random caster, pulled aggro, and in between kicks they got meleeed and died. The takeaway might be to rotate your big damage abilities occasionally on all mobs of the pack in case people just target whichever one the tab button selects first. Why do all this then? Well, this whole discussion started from the fact that you couldn't get into groups. But now you can, since you are the tank. Well, first of all, you get to play the game. Second, since tanks are a rarity, the chances of people adding you after a good run are way higher, and slowly you will build a group of people you will do content with. Once you have a stable group, the chances of you playing a DPS or something else are higher, since friends usually do that for each other. Not to mention, having an actual group means you don't need to wait in LFG. This can also mean the same thing for a guild. Some of the best players out there started pugging content until they got into a group that invited them into their actual guild, and blammo! Now they have people to do content with. Outside of this, the reality remains that tanking and healing are way less popular than DPSing, and will remain that way likely forever. You can start tanking now, get to do more content, make friends that will let you rotate to another role, or get into a guild that does the same. Or it could mean you'll just be a tank for now. But is that bad? Well, tanks will mostly play like a DPS player, but actually a DPS on steroids gameplay-wise. What do I mean by that? Well, once you get into the habit of rotating your defensives and active mitigation, which is something extra nobody else does, all that is left for you is to DPS. And usually that is what tanking comes down to once you know what you're doing. This is how you get tanks in groups that out-DPS the actual damage dealers. This is how you get tanks in the group that, despite the tank nerfs, don't die while everyone else does the walk of shame back to the pack. This is how you improve as a player. Not saying that non-tanks are bad players, but people that never try other roles will always have a limited understanding of the game. Accepting the additional responsibility will increase your skill set and make you a better player. And if you do decide to go back to DPSing, you can apply to groups with newly formed wisdom acquired from your tanking experience and add it to your application. I know not to stay in frontals, or I know not to pull before the tank, or not steal aggro, or use CCs when the tank needs to kite. I bet you anything more tanks will apply to your group or invite you to theirs that way, since they finally found someone that knows their struggle. And most importantly, tanks are bosses, dude. People can whine all they want, but if you are the tank, you decide when the combat starts. You decide where it goes. You decide how fast or big it becomes. In the words of the immortal Snap, you got the power. Grab the power by its nuts and pick the right race for your class. We went through the best combinations of races for all classes in the game with winners and losers right here, so check it out.